Mordecai. And you know this story well, that there's a time they live in a place, this is already in the exile, when they've been taken out of the nation of Israel, and they're living in Babylon. And the king of Babylon at this time is a wonderful, great, cozy, fuzzy, loving guy. No, he's not. In fact, when he calls for his queen, and she says, no, I don't think I'm coming over there today, he says, what? And she's gone. And his advisors say, you need a new queen. Yeah, I do. What are you going to do? Oh, get all the most beautiful girls in the kingdom and bring them in and just parade them before you and choose a queen. That's what you should do. And he says, good idea. Sounds great to me. Bring them all in here. And so Esther is chosen to go before the king along with all these other girls. This must have been the last thing in the world she wanted. She's lost her parents, she's living with Mordecai, and now she's called to go into the palace of the king. And you might think, wow, that is great. You just won the lottery. You have the chance to be the queen. And Esther's saying, I have to be the wife of a man who might just get mad and kill me at any minute. That's not the life I had in mind. And yet she goes in and goes through the time of training and spends all this time and is actually chosen to be the queen. And she's living this life. And then conflict happens, and a man rises up and decides, you know what I'm going to do? I hate Mordecai. I'm going to have his people destroyed. I've got the ear of the king. I will write an edict that all these people must be killed. And he starts this conspiracy to wipe out the Israelites. And it's at that point that Mordecai comes back and says, you may be here just for this reason. Let's look at Esther, chapter 4. Mordecai says to her, if you remain silent at this time, deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows if you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. I think Mordecai was a man who was in Esther's life. And I love his faith here, that he says, if you don't do something, deliverance for the Jews will rise from somewhere else. But it will cost you dearly. She's in a difficult position. Because she knows if I go to the king uninvited, that's an invitation for me to be put to death. All he has to say is, what are you doing here? And she's gone. But in faith, she stands. And look what she says. She doesn't just look at Mordecai and say, you know what? Nah, I don't know about this one. She responds faithfully with prayer. Look again. Esther 4, 14 to 16. Then Esther replied, go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me for 3 days, night or day, and my attendants will fast just as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it may be against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This is a young girl who is saying, I will go to the king. In essence, she calls her nation and the people around her to prayer and fasting because she's about to do something incredibly stupid and dangerous. I'm going to go before the king and ask him to save my people when there's already been an edict put in place. I've got no power to do this. I've got no ability to do this. Mordecai reminds her, perhaps God put you here just for this reason. Because God is up to things all the time, and you have the opportunity to stand up, and she decides, I would rather die being faithful to God than live in fear of any man. Now that's an example for all of us to hang on to. I would rather die being faithful to God than live in fear of any person. I don't care if you're a young man, a young woman, a 40-year-old. I would rather lose my job being faithful to God than stay in this job and work dishonestly. That challenges me. That's what Esther says to us. And so this young woman is a great example as we go on. We're going to take two more. Let's look very quickly at Samuel. We know that Samuel's mother Hannah wasn't able to have children. And so she prays to God, if I can have a child, I will dedicate him to you. And we see that God is faithful and gives her a son. And before too long, we see Hannah giving her son Samuel to Eli the priest. Now, moms, how difficult must that have been to be a woman with no children, crying out to God, I want to have a child. And when you finally get that child, as he's old enough to live on his own, he goes to the temple to live with Eli. Young boys, think about how that must have felt. All of a sudden, I'm not going to live with mom and dad anymore. I'm going to the temple to live with this guy named Eli. And when we read the scripture, we see that Eli wasn't necessarily the best dad in the world. Eli's sons were actually scoundrels. They too were priests, but they were cheating and they were stealing from the altar. And they were doing a lot of things that dishonored God. And so here's Eli, their dad, now in charge of Samuel. Poor Samuel is stuck here. We pick up in the story as Samuel is asleep. And he hears someone call his name. And he rises in the middle of the night and he heads over to Eli and says, hey, you called me. What did you want? And Eli says, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. Parents, have we been there? What are you doing here? It's the middle of the night. Go to sleep. Go to sleep. He comes a second time. You called me. Eli's like, boy, I did not call you. Go back to bed. Third time he comes, and this is where we pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 3, beginning verse 8. A third time the Lord called Samuel. Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, here I am. You called me. Eli's like, good grief, third time, boy. But finally, he clues into what's going on. Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, go and lie down. And if he calls you again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Then the Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. This is the first time that God gives a message to Samuel, who becomes the prophet, who anoints David, who anoints Saul, who becomes the first great prophet of Israel. And God gives him a message that is not very happy. If you read on, you will see that Samuel gets this message. Eli and his sons are about to be destroyed because his sons have been very unfaithful and done terrible things, and their father allowed this to happen, so Eli will go and his family line will be broken. And here's Samuel with this message. And the next morning, Eli says, did the Lord speak to you? Yes, sir, he did. What did he say? As Samuel, what are you going to say? Samuel doesn't want to tell him. And Eli presses him and tells him what the Lord said. And to his credit, Eli, in essence, says, let the Lord do what the Lord will do. And Samuel grows under Eli's guidance to be this amazing prophet of God. But this young man, again, stands up to do what is hard and gives us a great example. The last example I want to look at is Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we know how difficult it must have been for her. To be this young girl who is betrothed to the man of her dreams. And if Joseph wasn't the man of her dreams, he soon would be, right? Because they're about to be married. And she's about to have a good life, and everything is lined out until God shows up and says, hey, Mary, you're the chosen one. The Messiah is coming. And she's like, boy, both those things sound great. And he's going to be your child. Okay, me and Joseph, no. Now, before you're ready. This young girl, her world is completely torn apart by this message. What seems like good news to us is anything but good news to her, right? And yet, she has the faith to look to God and respond. Let's read in Luke chapter 2, or in chapter 1, beginning at verse 30. The angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. Even Elizabeth, your relative, is going to have a child in her old age, and she who is said to be unable to conceive is in her 6th month. For no word from God will ever fail. Mary responds, I am the Lord's servant. May your word be And Mary goes from here directly to her, to Elizabeth, who is older and who is also carrying a child. A woman who was barren. Now God has brought a son into her life. And a little aside I want you to recognize is that so often when God sets out to change the world, he doesn't do it with a massive army. He doesn't do it with a political campaign. Many, many times when God sets out to change the world, he sets the seed for change in the heart of a mother and brings forth a child. And that child, through the guidance of the mother, moves on to the will of God to change the world. So moms, in the middle of being so crazy and so busy, feeling like you can't do another thing, you may be one of those women that God has planted a seed in the heart of, and your child will be the change agent for what needs to happen in this community, to bring them back to God, to vitalize your church, to be the leader that we need. And so trust in this story, and trust in what God is doing. And these give us examples. And so you may be sitting there saying, well, yeah, you just told me 4 stories, I already know it. I got it. What's your point? Well, here's the point. We look at these 4 stories and we realize that these are all young people that God used from the very beginning and made wonderful things come out of their lives. And yeah, you're sitting here saying, well, I'm over 20. I'm way over 20. I'm not a young person. That's a good thing for them, but what about me? Look at these stories again. I want to walk through and talk with you about what's really going on in these stories. The young people are the central period in the story, but God is the central factor. They gave their life to God, and that's what made the difference. But they weren't alone. Let's take a look at the story of Josiah. Who was there for Josiah? In Josiah's life, we had Hilkiah the priest and Huldah the prophetess. And one person that doesn't get mentioned in the story that I would almost guarantee you was a major influence was most likely Josiah's mother. Remember, he had a dad who was an unfaithful king, and yet at 8 years old when he came in, he was a faithful king. Who taught him to do that? Probably not the dad. And so this mom is probably an unsung hero. And so what we see in the life of Josiah is at least 3 older people pouring into this young man, teaching him the word of the Lord. A priest, a prophet, and a mom. That's a pretty good backup crew who's going to make Josiah be a man of God. And he is able to stand on the shoulders of these giants and do more than his father or the unfaithful men before him. And so it's these parents and these people pouring into him. And so you need to look and realize, where am I in this story? Who am I in the children around me? Am I a support? Neither Hilkiah nor Huldah were in his family, and yet they poured into him and helped him become the man God needed him to be. Let's go on to the story of Esther. We see the power in this story. It's not Esther by herself. It's Mordecai. It's this uncle who stepped in when the parents were gone. Or it's her cousin, I'm sorry, I said uncle. It is her cousin who stepped in when the parents were gone and took her into his house and began to bless her and love on her and tell her she's precious. And I'm sure they had conversations about God and about faith. I mean, it's interesting that the name of God is not mentioned in that entire book, and yet at the same time, God is present all over it through this relationship. And deliverance comes through this girl because Mordecai challenges her. And she in return challenges Mordecai, if I'm going to do this, you pray and fast for me. Seems like they've probably done that before. That wasn't a new idea. And so some of us as older adults need to be pouring into our kids saying prayer and fasting now. I live a life of prayer. Let me show you how to do this. Let me walk with you. What's going on with you? Let me pray for you. And I mean that. I will do that on a daily basis. And I will see how you're doing and be that example in their life as Mordecai was for her. We move on to the story of Samuel. Samuel had a praying mother who prayed for him since before he was born. Moms and dads, I cannot underestimate the power of praying for your kids.